Supreme Court has struck down President Joe Biden's student relief plan, sealing the fate of more than 40 million borrowers. In a 6-3 vote, justices ruled that Biden exceeded his authority by pledging to forgive upwards of $400 billion of federal student loan debt.
Justice Roberts authored the majority opinion, writing, quote, "The Secretary asserts that the HEROES Act grants him the authority to cancel $430 billion of student loan principal. It does not. We hold today that the Act allows the Secretary to waive or modify existing statutory or regulatory provisions applicable to financial assistance programs under the Education Act, not to rewrite that statute from the ground up."
Justice Elena Kagan wrote the dissenting opinion, writing for herself and fellow liberal justices Sonia Sotomayor and Ketanji Brown Jackson. She slammed the majority for exceeding its proper limited role. Kagan read portions of the dissent aloud from the bench, which is a rare occurrence, saved only for when justices want to highlight their viewpoint. She wrote, "The right answer is the political branches, Congress, in broadly authorizing loan relief. The Secretary and the President in using that authority to implement the forgiveness plan. The majority instead says that is theirs to decide." Co-founder of the Student Debt Collective, Astra Taylor, is joining us to discuss this decision. Welcome, Astra.
Well, thanks for having me.
So I've seen a lot of progressives. This is kind of the legal standing I expected the student loan forgiveness to rely on, not the HEROES Act, but specifically the Higher Education Act of 1965, the portion that says the higher education or the education secretary may enforce, pay, compromise, waive, or release any right, title, claim, lien, or demand, however acquired, including any equity or any right of redemption. Is there still legal grounds for the Biden administration to forgive student loan debt, just not in a way that's restricted by the HEROES Act? I saw that the justices wrote in their majority opinion that the Higher Education Act has some limitations that would prevent it from forgiving the student loan debt. It doesn't seem to me that that's actually in the language of the Higher Education Act. What do you make of all of it?
I think that's both the majority opinion and the dissent don't limit the Higher Education Act. So for viewers, there are multiple authorities that can be used to cancel student loan debt. This case that the Supreme Court decided this morning was very much about the HEROES Act, which you mentioned, which is a law passed by Congress in 2003 that gave the executive branch and the Department of Education the authority to cancel student debt in the case of a national emergency. So certainly the COVID pandemic qualified as one. So this case really is limited to a discussion of the HEROES Act authority, and was ultimately, in my opinion, and in Justice Kagan's decision as well, decided erroneously because the people who brought the lawsuit, their claims to have standing to have been injured by the student debt relief plan were extremely flimsy and in fact based on falsehoods that were never questioned by the Supreme Court or really fact-checked or investigated. But the point is that this case is about one narrow authority that can be used to cancel student debt. There are still other legal options, and so advocates like myself are calling on the president to cancel student debt swiftly and immediately using another legal tool. And I think it's important to highlight the sentiment expressed in Kagan's great dissent, which is that the Supreme Court completely overstepped its bounds. I mean, she says essentially that what they did was unconstitutional today by arrogating to themselves power that should belong to the executive branch and to Congress. The HEROES Act and the Higher Education Act are both laws passed by Congress that authorize the cancellation of student debt. So it's just completely out of bounds for the Supreme Court to even hear this case, let alone to decide it the way that they did.
Do you feel like Biden duped voters at all by making this promise ahead of the election that he was going to be able to forgive the student debt, when it seemed like he knew that this was going to face a really uphill legal challenge and that he would likely lose at the Supreme Court?
I wouldn't use the word duped, but I would say that the Biden administration misstepped. They did not do this in a way that would give them a better chance of success. So what do I mean by that? there was a big fight in 2022 about whether or not student debt cancellation should be means tested, meaning whether or not there should be an income cap. One of the big objections from advocates like myself and from lawyers was that by having an income cap, the Department of Education would have to make people apply for relief because the Department of Education didn't have access to people's income information. And so this created a kind of unnecessary bureaucratic delay. The White House took 51 days to put the application online, took many weeks to begin approving applications. And those weeks were critical because there was actually, there were many lawsuits attempting to block the student debt program. And most of them were just tossed out of court because they were baseless. And these two cases that made it to the Supreme Court today, one of which was rejected unanimously, that was a case out of Texas, and then the case Nebraska versus Biden that succeeded today, those were moved up to the Supreme Court very rapidly, found sympathetic judges to hear them. And really, the problem was that the Biden administration basically gave its opponents a lot of time to throw everything at the wall. And in fact, that's a metaphor that Kagan uses in her dissent. She says, they're throwing theories of standing at the wall to see what sticks. And so that, I think that I wouldn't use the word duped, but I would say that the Biden administration underestimated the opposition on this and did not understand how important it was to move fast, to issue relief swiftly. And so we are calling on the White House, along with many others, to use another legal authority. But this is not about the legality. Student debt cancellation was always legal. Using the HEROES Act was legal. They really need to move fast. They need to move boldly with intention to get the relief to people. I mentioned the application. It's important to note that 16 million people got notifications from the federal government saying their application for student debt relief was approved. 60 million people got a communication from the federal government saying your debts are going to be canceled. People changed their life plans for this. They made choices thinking that this was a trustworthy message. It's really important that the administration follow through on that and get relief to people using another legal tool.
I think now, given this decision, it's a good time for us as a country to talk about the necessity of student loan debt cancellation and what that means for our economy and our country. I would point to the deficit we had in the private sector under the Clinton administration. Clinton was championed for having government surpluses, but the money in our economy in circulation needs to come from somewhere. So if it's not coming from the public sector or foreign debt, it's coming from the private sector. And driving the private sector into deficit is what many economists are saying put us in a situation where we had a 2008 financial crisis, which led a lot of young people to shelter and go to college instead of joining the workforce. And then we saw an increase in college attendance that was met with the rise of for-profit institutions and a 100% rate hike in tuition across the United States in our higher institutions. And that was followed with the increase of student loan debt, a 100% increase in student loan debt in the United States. And so what we're seeing now is about 0.9% of the outstanding balance of student loans and a flat rate of about $30 in consolidation fees is going in the hands of bankers who put us in this financial crisis in the first place. And now servicers can make between $400 and $1,000 per borrower. So in every step of the way, this was a situation where very wealthy people got rich off of working people in the United States doing the best they could do in an imperfect system. Do you think that's conditions where student loan cancellation is just?
Well, I think student loan cancellation is just across the board. You, for example, you both use the term debt forgiveness, loan forgiveness, which occasionally the Biden administration uses. The Debt Collective, the union for debtors that I'm part of, rejects the language of forgiveness because our position is that debtors have done nothing wrong. There's nothing immoral about pursuing an education. And in fact, education in this country, used to be free or close to it. Federal student loans were so trivial that the government didn't even bother keeping track of them until the late 90s. And this is why student debt cancellation is popular across the board. There's new polling released today by the Student Borrower Protection Center about just how popular the prospect of President Biden using a different legal authority, not tied to the pandemic, is with voters across the board. It's popular with independents. It's actually popular with a shocking number of Republicans. Why are people in the United States of America, a country that is divided on a lot of issues, so behind student loan cancellation? That's because people recognize that the cost of education has spiraled in a way that is disproportionate to everything else, especially to how much income people are making. And then they've realized that higher education has turned into a debt trap. What we need to do is publicly fund education instead of funding it through this circuitous route of student loans that allows for the kind of profiteering you're talking about, allows for loan servicers and other private interests to take a cut. Fund education directly, make education a public good again, and that recognize that actually has all sorts of social and economic benefits. What it means is that people can afford to be teachers without having to work a side job just to pay off their student loans, that people can go and become general practitioners instead of pursuing a more lucrative type of medicine, that people can afford to be entrepreneurial and start businesses. A generation weighed down by student debt actually isn't helping anybody. It's not helping debtors, but it's not helping the rest of us either. I'm someone who has paid off their student loan debt, so I don't stand to benefit from this. So I think the root of the problem is actually that we don't treat education as a public good. And one of the problems you've highlighted, the private interest here, one of the problems with this case that was decided by the Supreme Court today, is based on this idea that a private loan servicer was losing revenue. Now, what's ridiculous about the case today is that the loan servicer actually said, we don't want anything to do with this case. We're not party to this. Various states led by Republican attorneys generals, decided to sue on behalf of a loan servicer that didn't even want to be involved. So it's extremely, ridiculous, which is part of what the dissent today underscores. But this idea that people should be, that private companies should be profiteering from education, I think is, part of the bigger underlying problem. And that is why the Debt Collective not only fights for student loan cancellation, but for a return to the model of free public college that is accessible to everyone who wants it.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, Astra, but we'll have to have you back because I'd love to get your take on the idea that working class people who don't go to college and end up having lower incomes are paying for perhaps the student loan forgiveness that we're talking about here. But again, we're all out of time. Thank you so much. We'll be back with more Rising after this.